So welcome to the lectures on ecology, or the unit of ecology. First series of lectures, we're going to talk about the ecology of populations. How do populations work, and how do they fit into the big picture of ecology? So first of all, let's talk about what is ecology. So when you hear that term, ecology is the study of the interactions between the biotic, this is living, and abiotic, this is non-living, aspects of an environment. Okay, so what we have to keep in mind with ecology is we're looking at how do all the living things interact with each other, predator-prey relationships, things like that. But then also, how does the non-living or abiotic aspects of an environment work with the living? What's the temperature going to do? What's the pH of an environment going to do towards the living? And then how do they interact back and forth? So something we want to keep in mind when we look at ecology and the study of ecology here. The living will influence the non-living. Tree grows up, it produces shade, that changes the temperature of the area, changes the moisture content, changes the soil quality. The abiotic also will come back and influence the biotic, or the non-living will influence the living. So the pH of the soil often determines what can live there. All right, so that's the big picture of ecology. Now, when we study it at the population level, we're looking at what's going on within the dynamics of a single population. So often we start looking at ecology, so we say, okay, let's pick an organism or type of organism, this particular fish. This is called a fairy bacillate. How does that single individual fit into the population? Is it a male? Is it a female? Is it reproducing age? Is it old? Is it healthy? Is it sick? Etc. How does the population work? How many males? How many females? Is the population growing? Is the population shrinking? What's going on there? How does that population fit into the community? Is it prey for other species? Is it a predator population? Is it both? What are the dynamics and interactions between all of the different populations? That's community. And then how does that community fit into the bigger ecosystem? How does it work with other communities? A small part of the reef here, how does that connect to the bigger entire coral reef ecosystem? All right, so ecology has a lot of levels to it. And so as we start approaching, we always start with just a single individual. So this is a fish called a yellow tang. Find them on coral reefs in the Caribbean. You'll find them on coral reefs in the Pacific, Indo-Pacific. But we look at this guy and say, okay, is this a male? Is it a reproducing male? Is it the dominant male in the group? Maybe that male is the dominant reproductive male for that entire population. Some species, some populations, one male will reproduce, all the others are kept from reproduction. So how does that one male fit into the big picture of all the yellow tangs on the reef, or in that population at least? And then what's going to happen if that yellow tang gets eaten? You go, oh no, it just got eaten. How does that influence the population? If it's the only breeding male, will another male start reproducing? Or does that population fragment and disband because that dominant male is no longer there to, in a sense, control or direct what happens with reproduction in that population? So these are all the different dynamics that ecology and ecologists study. So, like I said, there's a lot of dynamics going on and different interactions and things happening when we study ecology. All right, so starting out to study ecology, we want to figure out where are things at? Where are they at within the area we're studying, within the field or within the reef, within the ecosystem, etc.? So we look for what we call distribution. And we often find distribution in one of three patterns. The first pattern is called uniform distribution. This is an even spacing. This is not very common in nature. But in a bean field, that's what we aim for, uniform distribution. In a cornfield, uniform distribution. In your garden, uniform distribution. You create an even spacing between each plant to maximize resource use, to minimize competition, and to try to increase productivity. So uniform distribution, again, it does happen occasionally in nature. Usually, or one example is when these birds in the Arctic go to breed, and there's hundreds of thousands of birds in a small space, and they're trying to build nests. They all sit down, create a nest where they're sitting, and so here's a little bird nest, and then the territory is how far out they can reach with their beak. Right next to them is another bird sitting on a nest, and its territory is as far as it can reach with its beak. And then a third bird with its nest and its territory, again, is as far out as it can reach with its beak. So all of the nests and the territories are pretty much the same size. That's one rare example of uniform distribution. Okay, more common is random or scattered distribution. With this type of distribution, they're anywhere, they're everywhere, they're scattered. This occurs when resources are plentiful. You got a lot of food out there in the springtime. These guys are going to be wherever. They're going to just wander around. They're going to go wherever they need to go to find food. There's plenty of food, so they just kind of meander. And if you look at the graph there, there's no rhyme or reason. There's no organization to their distribution. That's why they call them scattered or random distribution. Now, what will happen to the moose in the picture here is later in the fall, as resources dwindle, because they're changing, because ecology is constantly changing, environmental factors change, the abiotic, non-living factors change because of seasonal change, resources dwindle. There's fewer and fewer resources, so then the distribution becomes more of a clumped or grouped distribution. So this means they concentrate around those resources. This occurs, resources are limited. So, there's only so much water. Things are going to concentrate around the water. There's a little pocket of nutrients. Things are going to concentrate around those nutrients. There's shade in one spot but not another. Things concentrate or clump around resources. So the saying about 90% of the fish are found in 10% of the lake, very, very true. Fish clump around resources. So if you're a fisherman and you go out for bluegill, you fish certain parts of the lake. You're going to fish for bass. You fish for certain parts of the lake. You fish where the resources will be that the bluegill need or that the bass need. So our picture here of these grasses and trees, notice you have a little clump of grass right here. And then nothing. And then here's another clump. Here's another clump. They're clumped because for whatever reason, the nutrients in the soil in those little spots provide the resources needed for that by that grass. So the grass can grow. Otherwise, the grass wouldn't grow in those spots. Okay, so we want to figure out where are things at when we're looking at populations. Where are we going to go to study these things? Let's look at the little pockets. Are they random or are they uniform distribution? Now, once we find them, then we start looking at, is the population going to grow? This is an example of a growth pattern. So the key for population growth, and I'm going to highlight this, this is an incredibly important concept. The key for population growth is looking at how many females do you have of reproductive age. If you have a large number of reproductive females and, gotta stress the and enough resources, space, water, food, etc., then you're going to get a very rapid growth. This is known as exponential growth. So what can happen to a population? It starts out and just kind of muddles along. It's just kind of maintaining itself here. And all of a sudden there's more girls in the population, they're growing up, they're getting a little older, they're reaching maturity, they're now reaching reproductive age, and there's a little bit more food available. All of a sudden the girls are having more babies, the babies are surviving, and the population starts growing really fast into what we call exponential growth. So exponential is a rapid growth. It has what we call a J-shaped growth curve. Kind of flatlines and then it explodes fairly quickly. Within 2 to 3 generations, that population went from maybe 1,000 up to almost 65,000. So, generation 5, you had about 1,000. Generation 6, maybe up to 1,500. At generation 7, you're now up to maybe 3,000 or 4,000. Here you're at 10,000. Now you're at about 30,000. Now you're at about 65,000. So it goes up really, really fast. That's the way you want your money to grow, exponentially. Doesn't really happen though. Okay, so here are the consequences of exponential growth in our kitchen. Cockroaches. Nasty little buggers. If you don't control the cockroach population, it's supposed to be a cockroach, but it's a very poor drawing. If you don't control the cockroach population, it's going to grow exponentially. So what we have to do is control populations if we don't want them to grow. So there will be a list or a whole series of things called limiting factors. These things control population growth. This is stuff like how much food, how much space, predators, disease, etc. I mean, there's a huge list here I want you guys to start thinking about. What controls population growth? All these things. When you remove limiting factors, there's plenty of food, plenty of space, no predators, no disease. It's a great environment. Populations tend to grow exponentially. So you leave for vacation and your kitchen was messy and dirty and there was food all over. There's your exponential growth of cockroaches in your kitchen. Now the good news, if you decide not to do anything about your kitchen, which would be pretty disturbing, but what will happen naturally with your population is that it will hit a thing called carrying capacity. So the environment can only support so many individuals. There's only so much space, there's only so much food, there's only so much, etc. So this red line that I'm trying to highlight here is what we call carrying capacity. As you grow exponentially, you start to put pressure on your population. The population gets bigger. Now there's more competition for food. There's less space. You're more likely to attract predators and diseases occur easier in a big population. So then your population starts to slow down with the growth and it hits carrying capacity and it tends to kind of level off like this. Now it doesn't flatline, it tends to oscillate roughly like the green is doing here at the carrying capacity of the environment. That leveling off, that is known as logistic growth. So I'm going to show you in our next lecture an example of what happens when you overshoot carrying capacity. It's not a good scenario. All right, so let's talk again in the next lecture about carrying capacity.